started recording. You're all good.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today, and welcome to the first of our four-part webinar mini-series entitled Exploring the Intersection Between Cancer, Obesity, and Disparities. I'm Marianne Van Dyne with NCI Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities, and on behalf of the Trans NCI Obesity and Cancer Disparities Workgroup, I have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's webinar. We are delighted to have so many of you join us today. First, we have a couple of housekeeping items to share. Mabinti Kanta from our communications team will walk us through these items. Mabinti.
Again, welcome and thank you guys for joining us. My name is Mabinti Kante and I will be your WebEx technical support host. Before we dive into today's meeting, I wanted to provide some quick information on the webinar platform. All lines have been muted on entry and will remain muted the duration of the webinar. Please submit questions throughout the presentation using the chat or Q&A box and select all panelists. A moderator will ask your comments and/or questions on your behalf at the end of the presentation. If you require technical assistance, please feel free to contact the host, Jenny Tweston, via the chat panel, and she'd be happy to assist you. Closed captioning is available and a link has been provided for you in the chat box. We also wanted to make you aware that today's webinar is being recorded. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Van Dyne.
Thanks so much, Mabinti. As Mabinti noted, we do invite and we encourage your questions. We will do our very best to address them. That said, with close to 800 registrants, we do hope you'll understand if we're not able to get to all of them. So with that, next I'd like to give you some context. Next slide, please, for today's webinar and also the mini-series. Today, we will provide you with an overview, a 30,000-foot view, if you will, of the intersections between cancer, obesity, and disparities. In the subsequent 3 webinars in March, we will examine these intersections in more detail. Today, you will hear from a truly outstanding panel of speakers who are conducting cancer-related research in methodology, biology, genomics, the socio-environment, nutrition, and food insecurity. Focusing on racial and ethnically diverse populations, we'll examine disparity and associations between obesity and cancer risk, highlighting a number of common cancers, including breast and colon, as well as endometrial. Our plans are that ultimately this webinar and the webinar mini-series overall will help inform and advance research that can help reduce cancer health disparities. Next slide, please. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our discussant for today's webinar, Dr. Lucile Adams-Campbell. Dr. Adams-Campbell is Professor of Oncology at the Georgetown Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center. She is also the Associate Director for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Senior Associate Dean for Community Outreach Engagement at the Cancer Center. Dr. Adams-Campbell will now provide some opening remarks and introduce our speakers. Lucile?
Thank you very much. And if I can have my first slide, I'm just going to welcome everybody today. I think this is a very exciting topic, exploring the intersection between cancer, obesity, and disparities. And you'll note, as Dr. Van Dyne said, we have a wealth of speakers here today, and you'll hear from different aspects. Next, please. Next. As you've all have seen before, we know that the trends in cancer, the incidence rates are declining, but still non-Hispanic whites have the highest rates, and Blacks are right behind them, just underneath on this slide. In the following slide, no matter what the position is for, the next slide, please, no matter what the position is, mortality rates are extremely high and higher than all other race ethnic groups, as indicated with the purple bar at the top of the map. And I just want you to notice that the rates are declining. So that's very good news. I mean, so we should be very happy our incidence rates are declining, our mortality rates are declining, but our risk factors are increasing. And next slide. And when you look at the map, and you'll probably see this again, but this is for non-Hispanic Blacks, and the dark color signify more than 35% of that population in the state is obese. About 3 decades ago, there was no dark color shown on a map because we didn't have the obesity problem. And next slide, just to let you know that the non-Hispanic whites have very minimal amounts of obesity. So we see these contrasts in this major risk factor that we're going to talk about today. And you see the contrast in, although you see declining rates for incidence and mortality for cancer, but you still see major disparities. But can it be attributed to obesity? And we'll see in a minute, the next slide, that when we talk about obesity and cancer, what people really need to know that obesity is linked to 12, and some places say 13 cancers, whether it's pharynx, esophageal, cancers, breast cancer, any of these cancers, but yet 7 out of 10 people in the communities have overweight or obesity. But only 52% recognize that obesity is linked to cancer. So we're going to hear discussions that will talk about food, environment, different aspects, so you can see how we need to protect ourselves, how we need to educate people about what's happening between obesity and cancer, so that we can see a decline in obesity rates and maybe even a faster and rapid decline in the incidence of mortality if we address this risk factor, which is behind the tobacco, not smoking. So now I would like to set the stage and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elisa Bandera, who was Professor-in-Chief of Cancer Epidemiology and Health Outcomes. She's co-leader, Cancer Prevention and Control, and the interim director of Population Sciences Research Support Shared Resource at Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey. And she's Professor of Medicine at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Dr. Bandera.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar series, and I appreciate the invitation. Thank you to the organizers. So I'm going to be talking in the brief time that I have allocated about what we know and what we don't know about the racial disparities in the association of obesity and cancer. So Lucille mentioned already that number one thing that we know is that there are racial ethnic disparities in cancer incidence and mortality. And here you can see 2 examples for breast and colorectal. And as a disclaimer, I will say most of my work is in breast cancer. So you will see that most of my examples are in breast. Let me see. Number 2 is obesity is the second largest contributor to cancer. So you can see here how it affects different. We heard before that but here you can see actually how much is attributed to obesity. And to mention, I'm not going to go into it because I know that other webinars later on are going to cover this, but we cannot talk about obesity without really talking about how obesity affects through the cancer continuum, from diagnosis to clinical management to affecting quality of life, progression and survival. And in terms of mechanisms, I'm not going to go into details, but just to mention that there are interrelated pathways, well-established pathways that implicate sex steroids, IGF, insulin resistance, increasing in systemic chronic inflammation, affecting oxidative stress, and also affecting immune function. The third fact is that obesity is not equally distributed across populations, and you can see how it affects primarily Black. I mean, it's very high in all populations, but it's disproportionately high among non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanics, men and women. And this is for abdominal obesity, which is important because it's part of the metabolic syndrome. It's associated with visceral fat, and it has increased risk of cardiovascular health as well as cancer. And you can see it's extremely high in all populations, but particularly for Blacks and Hispanics. And it's extremely alarming, the increased risk in Hispanics, in women. So what are the challenges and the research gaps? again, I don't have enough time to talk into detail, but most of the major challenge is that both obesity and cancer are heterogeneous. So when we're looking at it, we have to look at obesity type. For example, that not everybody that is obese is metabolically unhealthy, and the same way you can have normal weight that is and have metabolic obesity. The second thing is obesity type according to body composition, like sarcopenic obesity that happen mostly in cancer survivors. And then the effect that when you're looking at obesity and cancer, you really need to take into account cancer subtypes. And for example, for breast cancer is mostly luminal A being affected. For endometrial cancer is type 1, etc. And then the major impact relevant to this is that we don't know the impact of body fat distribution and body composition in population-based studies by race ethnicity. There's a lot of research that we need to do in this area. And then, of course, we need to know more about mechanistic pathways. So all of this complicates when we're trying to understand the association between obesity and cancer by race ethnicity. This is what I just mentioned complicates this even more, because what we know about obesity and cancer for the most part largely is basically based on BMI. Why? Because it's easy to obtain. In large epidemiologic studies, you have weight and height that you can even obtain by self-report. But the problem with BMI is that it really doesn't capture body fat distribution and body composition, which may be more relevant. And to make it even more interesting, body composition varies by race ethnicity. And just as an example, we know that African-American women compared to non-Hispanic whites tend to have higher lean mass and lower fat mass for a given BMI. And they tend to have lower visceral adipose tissue for a given amount of body fat. And despite that, they have are more likely to have insulin resistance. Then the levels of obesity-related biomarkers also differ by race ethnicity, including adipokines and inflammatory markers. So all of this makes it more complicated when you're trying to interpret association by race ethnicity, particularly you're just focusing on BMI. So I mentioned the differences in association between obesity and cancer subtypes. This is another complication, that the prevalence of subtypes also change or varies by race ethnicity. And you can see here that triple negative, which is the most aggressive form of breast cancer, is more common among non-Hispanic Blacks, while the luminal type, which is more strongly associated with obesity, is more common in non-Hispanic whites. This is to illustrate how obesity and the relationship of obesity of cancer varies both by menopausal status and also varies by subtype. So you can see here that what we have known for decades about the relationship between obesity and breast cancer, which is an inverse association with premenopausal women and increases risk in postmenopausal women, that's really true only for ER positive. But for triple negative, what we found, this is data from the AMBER consortium in African-American women combining 4 studies. We found that it was actually the inverse. And other studies have found this after we published this, where the association with, so basically obesity increases risk in premenopausal women for triple negative. However, for waist-to-hip ratio, we found that there was suggestion of increased risk, both in premenopausal and postmenopausal. So that's something that has been suggested, that maybe waist-to-hip ratio may be a better proxy for adiposity, of a better indicator of risk, particularly for ER-negative and triple-negative breast cancer. Switching quickly to mortality. So the risk of mortality after a breast cancer diagnosis, and this is the association with BMI. This is data from the California Breast Cancer Survivorship Consortium, which included 6 studies, combining 6 studies. And it's very interesting how they found different, you can see clearly that there are differences by race ethnicity. This is BMI, and you can see that not much going on for African Americans, but very high increased rates for Asian Americans. When they look at waist to hip ratio, the risk was, especially for all-cause mortality, was very high for African Americans. However, this is very interesting and very intriguing. However, they didn't have enough power to look at this association by subtype so that we can compare triple negative, for example, risk for African Americans, for example, versus non-white or Latinas. So in summary, we know that racial ethnic disparities in obesity and through the cancer continue to persist. And we really are not sure. There's some suggested evidence that BMI may be more of a risk factor for Asian Americans, for example, than for African Americans. But we really need larger studies where we can, you have seen how complicated these studies are, this association when you have to divide by menopausal status, by subtype, but by race ethnicity, you end up with very small numbers very quickly. So we need larger studies. We need more representation of minorities in the studies that we have. And in these studies, we really need to consider genetic ancestry, acculturation, country of origin, financial hardship, and other socio-demographic and cultural factors. And it remains to be a challenge to have good measures of adiposity and obesity-related biomarkers. That's key so that we can differentiate the effects of different obesity types to understand biological mechanisms. And of course, we cannot forget about COVID pandemic, which is being worse in every single axis for minority, and is affecting also the cancer burden. So we can expect that we're going to see particularly an effect for obese minority men and women over time. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bandera. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Victoria Bae Jump, who is at Chapel Hill Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. She's professor of the Division of Gynecologic Oncology, Director of Fellowship Training in Gynecologic Oncology, Director of the Translational Research, and leader of the UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center Gynecological Oncology Clinical Trials. So Dr. Bae Jump.
All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this webinar today. And I'm going to be talking today about racial disparities and obesity and endometrial cancer with a focus on the underlying genomics that may be also driving this disparity. Sorry, I'm hitting it a little too fast. So endometrial cancer is the fourth most common cancer among women in the United States, and it's actually the only major cancer type to be increasing in both frequency and mortality, thought to be due in part to the obesity epidemic. Obesity, diabetes, and insulin resistance are well-known risk factors associated with a higher risk of developing and dying from endometrial cancer. And just for reference, up to 65% of endometrial cancer patients are obese, really making endometrial cancer by far the most obesity-driven cancer. Non-Hispanic Black women suffer an overall 55% higher mortality from endometrial cancer than non-Hispanic white women. Incidence rates, unfortunately, are increasing threefold for Black women compared to white women, and mortality rates are actually twice as high. So what are the underlying causes for racial disparities in endometrial cancer? For the most part, we actually don't know, but it's undoubtedly multifactorial with potential contributing factors such as access to equitable care, host environment, and response to treatment, higher risk of more lethal histological subtypes like serous histology tumors, and molecular subtypes such as those containing p53 mutations and copy number high subtypes, higher rates of obesity and/or diabetes, as well as other unknown biological factors. Today, I will focus mostly on the genomic factors underlying this disparity. So in 1983, Bachman broadly grouped endometrial cancers into two separate categories, type 1 and type 2, based on both clinical and biological factors. Type 1 or endometrioid histology tumors are more common. They comprise about 80% of endometrial cancers and are thought to arise from unopposed estrogen stimulation. Most are diagnosed at stage 1 with a relatively high 5-year survival rate. These tumors are traditionally associated with obesity and obesity-related comorbidities such as diabetes and hypertension. Type 2 or non-endometrioid histology tumors are the remaining 20% of endometrial cancers, with serous histology being the most common among these atypical histologies. These cancers behave much more aggressively and tend to arise in an atrophic endometrium. Non-endometrioid tumors more often present in advanced stage with a much poorer 5-year survival stage for stage compared to endometrioid histology tumors. In addition, Black women are proportionally more likely to have type 2 cancers than white women. It's important to note, though, that obesity and diabetes are risk factors for both endometrioid and non-endometrioid endometrial cancers. In support of this, these are findings from a multi-institutional study of about 1,400 endometrial cancer patients treated at UNC and our neighbor Duke over a 5-year period. We found high obesity rates of both type 1 and type 2 patients at 66 versus 51%. In addition, we also found similar rates of diabetes in type 1 and type 2 patients. Of note, obesity rates were definitely higher in Black versus white women at 75% of our Black women patients and 58% of our white patients. Furthermore, Black women were twice as likely to have diabetes. Genetic alterations are quite distinct between type 1 and type 2 endometrial cancers. Genetic alterations seen in endometrioid endometrial cancers include microsatellite instability, E10 deletions and mutations, PIK3CA mutations amplification, PIK3R1R2 mutations, activation of KRAS, ARID1 mutations, and beta-catenin mutations. In contrast, the genetic profile for non-endometrioid tumors distinctly differs from endometrioid tumors and is associated with p53 mutations, overexpression of HER2/neu, p16 inactivation, PIK3CA mutations, amplifications, and E-cadherin alterations. Further genomic characterization of endometrial cancers via the Cancer Genome Atlas project found that classification of endometrial cancers into the categories of simply type 1 and type 2 was far too simplistic. Alternatively, TCGA classified endometrial cancer into 4 subtypes: wholly ultramutated, microsatellite instability, hypermutated or MSI, copy number low, and copy number high. The poly, MSI, and copy number low clusters were composed mostly of endometrioid endometrial cancers, while most serous and about a quarter of endometrioid endometrial cancers were found in the copy number high cluster. Women with poly tumors had the best progression-free survival, while women with copy number high tumors, not surprisingly, had the worst progression-free survival. In addition to the poly, MSI, copy number low, copy number high molecular subtyping classifications, TCGA also broke endometrial cancers into other molecular subtypes based on somatic copy number alterations and RNA sequencing data. 4 somatic copy number alterations clusters were identified, labeled simply 1, 2, 3, and 4. RNA sequencing identified 3 distinct clusters termed the mitotic, immunoreactive, and hormonal subtypes. For each of these classifications, TCGA found one of these subtypes to be more aggressive than the others in regards to survival data, including SCNA cluster subtype 4 versus 1, 2, and 3, and the mitotic subtype versus immunoreactive and hormonal. It should be noted that only 14% of the endometrial cancers in TCGA were from Black women. Jabal et al. Subsequently assessed racial disparities among molecular subtypes of endometrial cancer using the TCGA dataset. This study found that all of the aggressive TCGA molecular subtypes were more common in Black versus white women, including copy number high, SCNE cluster subtype 4, and the mitotic subtype. For example, the copy number high subtype was found in 62% of tumors from Black women versus 24% of tumors from white women. Furthermore, worse progression-free survival was found for Black versus white women for each of these aggressive subtypes. UNC-Seq was a Lineberger-sponsored targeted gene sequencing effort across cancer sites with greater than 10,000 patients enrolled, including 325 endometrial cancer patients. UNC-Seq utilized a homegrown 800 targeted gene panel of the UNC endometrial cancers, 58 tumors from Black women and 292 from white women. We found that Black versus white patients had a higher BMI, more grade 3 and non-endometrioid endometrial cancers, more often presented at an advanced stage, and had a higher risk of recurrence. Sequencing of these endometrial cancers found a higher incidence of p53 mutations in endometrial cancers from Black versus white women at 47% versus 19%, mirroring TCGA-related racial disparities. In contrast, the copy number low subtype was found in 25% of tumors from Black women and 48% in white women. We're continuing to work on a deeper dive into this genomic data and Black versus white comparisons. One potential interesting finding so far is that we see a much higher mutation rate of PIK3CA in serous tumors from white versus Black patients. So there have definitely been a number of challenges related to studying cancer disparities in endometrial cancer, as I list here. There's a lack of prospective population-based epidemiological studies detailing histological and molecular subtype with race, obesity, and comorbid treatments, access and receipt of NCCN recommended treatment and follow-up care. In addition, there have been small representative numbers of endometrial cancer samples from Black women in our large-scale molecular profiling studies, such as TCGA. And then finally, we have a very limited understanding of the impact of obesity and its related comorbidities as modulators of endometrial cancer progression and treatment efficacy in Black women, despite knowing that the obesity rates are higher. So given this, and hopefully to begin to address racial disparities in endometrial cancer, we've actually embarked on the Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study, which opened officially in September of 2020. The Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study is a North Carolina-based population study that will actually reach all 100 counties in North Carolina through rapid case ascertainment. The mission of this study is really to oversample Black endometrial cancer patients with our overarching goal to enroll 1,000 women in 3 years with baseline interview and tumor data, including 460 Black women, which will be 10 times the number of Black patients enrolled in TCGA. In brief, the study includes baseline interviews and then follow-up interviews at 12 and 24 months after diagnosis. Medical records will also be obtained to assess details around diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes. And lastly, tumor blocks will be obtained for molecular subtyping using our same 800 gene panel that we used in our UNC-SEEK study. So next, I just want to briefly touch on the results of this recently completed clinical trial that should at least a little bit impart control for equity in clinical care. And I believe that the results of this study actually drive home the unknown potential differences between Black and white women that could impact chemotherapeutic efficacy. So GOG 286B was an energy oncology clinical trial. I served as the national PI. This was a randomized phase 2 to 3 trial of metformin plus placebo plus standard of care paclitaxel carboplatin in women with advanced and recurrent endometrial cancer. 460 women were enrolled. Sadly, metformin did not actually improve on the efficacy of paclitaxel carboplatin, although we do have biomarker studies underway to assess if any women benefited from metformin treatment. However, one critically important observation for our study was actually the worst outcomes for Black versus white women in regards to response rate and survival. The Black race was associated with worse progression-free survival than white race and worse overall survival than white race. And these are the overall survival curves here, where the median overall survival for our Black endometrial cancer patients was 18 months versus 36 months for our white patients. Response rates also differed, with an overall response rate for our white patients at 64% versus 43% for Black women. And then finally, obesity rates also differed, with 64% of our Black patients being obese versus 48% of our white patients. So I really think the trial highlights the unknown racial differences that could actually impact chemotherapeutic efficacy. Of note, DNA and RNA sequence studies are already underway to further explore these alarming differences using the same sequencing that we use in UNC-SEEK and are also using now in the Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study. So finally, in summary, endometrial cancer harbors one of the worst cancer disparities for Black women than any other cancer. There definitely seems to be some evidence to suggest that more aggressive molecular and genomic subtypes in the tumors of Black women may drive this disparity, at least in part. However, there's several key unanswered questions to these findings. Number one, why do Black women develop these more aggressive molecular subtypes of endometrial cancer? And then secondly, is obesity a potential driver of these more aggressive molecular subtypes, noting the higher obesity rates and diabetes rates in our Black endometrial cancer patients? And then finally, critical to understanding this disparity is to define the molecular alterations in the endometrial cancers of Black women in the context of other biologic and non-biological factors that may drive more aggressive behavior of endometrial cancer or lead to worse outcomes, which is one of our hopes of the Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study. And thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Dr. Bae Jump. And next, we're going to hear from Dr. Marvella E. She is professor at the Department of Public Health Sciences, Medical University of South Carolina, the Associate Director of Population Sciences and Cancer Disparities at the NCI designated Collins Cancer Center, the Associate Director for Population Sciences and Cancer Disparities at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Ford.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about obesity prevalence today. But first, I'd like to start with a definition of disparities, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So as you can see by this definition from the National Cancer Institute, the definition of cancer disparities spans the continuum from diagnosis all the way to survivorship, and obesity can impact every part of this continuum. We've already seen in the US that Blacks, shown in the light blue, have the highest obesity rates compared to any other racial or ethnic group, and that's true particularly for Black women compared to white women. When we look at this map, which Dr. Adams-Campbell showed, this shows the prevalence of obesity in the United States, and the darker the red, the higher the prevalence of obesity. This map shows the prevalence of obesity in the United States for whites only, and you can see there are very few states that have the darkest red. Now we're looking at a map showing the prevalence of obesity in the US among Hispanic, Latino, Latinx adults. And you can see there are some clusters of states in the Midwest and the Northwest. And when we look at the prevalence of obesity among Blacks in the US, we see that there's widespread geographic distribution, northern, southern representation. As we've heard, many different types of cancer are associated with overweight and obesity, including gallbladder cancer, kidney cancer, and liver cancer. I'd like to present a case study of obesity and cancer in South Carolina. These are population facts for the South Carolina on the left and the US on the right. So as you can see, South Carolina has a population of about 5 million compared with 328 million in the US. We're fairly evenly divided between males and females as in the US. What makes South Carolina stand out is that 34% of our population is rural compared to 19% in the US. And 75% of the South Carolina counties include rural areas. South Carolina also has a large population of Blacks, 27%, compared to 13% in the US as a whole. We have a small but growing Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population compared to the US, and South Carolinians have a lower levels of education compared to the US national averages for high school diploma, bachelor's degree, and those are reflected in the lower per capita income in South Carolina versus the US as a whole, 28 versus 32 or 33, and median household income of 51,000 versus 60,000. Within South Carolina, we see glaring disparities in median household income, with whites having a median household income of 54,000, Blacks 31,000, and Hispanics, Latinx, Latinos 38,000. We have 15% of the population in South Carolina is below the poverty level compared to only 12% in the US as a whole. And in 2018, the federal poverty income threshold was $25,465 for a family of 4 with 2 children and $17,308 for a single parent of 1 child. So these are people below that level. We have rural residents in South Carolina, which poses unique needs and opportunities. We have transportation issues, distance to specialty care sites, difficulty sometimes accessing cancer clinical trials. We also have a unique Sea Island or Gullah population, which are primarily descendants of enslaved Africans from Sierra Leone and other West African countries. And this group is genetically and culturally distinct. So continuing our discussion of South Carolina, South Carolina includes what I call the I-95 corridor of economic disadvantage. This I-95 corridor has many counties with high needs or neighboring counties with needs. So this is a very high need, low resource area of the state. Many of the counties in the I-95 corridor are food deserts. And one thing to point out is that many people living in food deserts may be overweight and obese, but they are also malnourished. People are buying cheap, inexpensive, unhealthy food. This chart shows comparisons, economic comparisons of Blacks versus whites in South Carolina. This got a little extended here, but what I wanted to point out is the question here is how much higher is the poverty rate for Black residents as opposed to white residents? And the answer, 150%. So in South Carolina, the poverty rate for Blacks is 150% higher than for whites. And we can see that when we look at persistent poverty in the I-95 corridor counties. The lighter blue represents persistent child poverty, and the darker blue represents persistent child and total population poverty. And you can see that most of the counties in the I-95 corridor are considered persistent poverty counties. Who lives in the I-95 corridor? This map shows the percentage of white residents, and you can see the darker the purple, the higher the percentage of whites. Very few whites live in the I-95 corridor. This map shows the percentage of blacks living in the I-95 corridor, and here the darker the green, the higher the percentage of blacks, and you can see that most of the people living in the I-95 corridor are black. And this map shows the rural areas, and as you can see, most of the I-95 corridor is rural. So now we've painted a picture where we have rural, underserved areas of the state. What impact does that have? We know there are high rates of obesity in the I-95 corridor. What's the impact on cancer? When we look at female breast cancer, we can see that the darker the orange, the higher the rate of cancer death. And so in the I-95 corridor, there's a lot of orange. There's also a cluster in another poorer area of the state called the PD area, where mainly white residents live. But the I-95 corridor by far has some of the highest breast cancer death rates. And the same is true for prostate cancer death rates as well. In South Carolina, the death rate for prostate cancer for Black men is 3 times higher than for white men. So what are the social determinants of health, and how do they contribute to obesity and cancer risk? Well, let's start with defining the social determinants of health using Healthy People 2020's definition as the areas where people live, learn, work, play, worship, and age. And these affect our quality of life. The I-95 corridor is an example of place. It's where people live and work. And people in the I-95 corridor do not have a sense of security and well-being. They are living in poverty. Many people are living in poverty. They are undernourished and overweight and obese. And we also have residential segregation. We saw that most of the people living in the I-95 corridor were Black. They live far from grocery stores and medical facilities. People also tend to live in multi-generational households. And I would like to point out that while Blacks are overrepresented in jails, prisons, and detention centers, Blacks do not commit more crimes than whites. Blacks are over-prosecuted for the crimes they do commit. So let's look at a simple model of the social determinants of health disparities. Some colleagues and I developed this model back in 2014. We have social environmental factors, income, education, having health insurance coverage, which leads to susceptibility to disease, access to health care, and then ultimately health disparities. In our slightly more complex model, we started to introduce behavior. So here we have structural life inequalities, and we have chronic stressors like job insecurity, which lead to behaviors like overeating that help people to cope with the stressors, but also lead to more physical health disparities. And this is the summary of this presentation, which is to say that in our work moving forward, it's very important to include the social environmental factors when we're looking at the relationship between obesity and cancer and different racial and ethnic groups. This is a model that could be employed in future studies moving forward, where we have environmental factors, neighborhood effects, living in a rural area, not having access to healthy foods as much as other people, living in a food desert, and the stressors of job, family issues, financial hardships, and engaging in poor health behaviors like overeating and not becoming physically active. Those behaviors are linked to physical health disorders like cancer. And there's some thought that they relate to the chronic activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that fight or flight syndrome, and just being in a constant state of fight or flight causes or contributes to the development of organ damage and even to cancer. So areas for future investigation, we could use a model such as the previous one, which is the summary of this presentation, to increase our understanding of the stronger association between obesity and cancer in some racial and ethnic groups. And some of those social determinants of health could help to explain the stronger relationship. We have seen that obesity is more strongly associated with an increased risk of prostate cancer among Black men than among white men. And there may be differences in the biological effects of obesity between these two groups, such as a difference in the effects of obesity on inflammation or insulin secretion. We also want to evaluate gut microbes. And we have a talk coming up now where we can focus on changing the microbiota of cancer patients to improve their outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. And now we'll hear from Dr. Stephen O'Keefe from the University of Pittsburgh and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He's professor and director of African Microbiome Institute in Stellenbosch University. Dr. O'Keefe.
Good evening, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to share some research experience with you. Let's get the ball rolling here. Okay, so the good thing is, speaking, I think the fifth or sixth, a lot of the background has already been discussed. And so therefore I will skip that and go to the science. What we've heard is that there is a strong association between obesity and now so many cancers. About a few years ago, there were only 5 or 6, and now it's up to 17. So with the other epidemic, which is obesity, more problems are occurring with regard to carcinogenesis. So I'm going to argue that the differences and the that account for variations in cancer around the world is related to what you eat. And more specifically, I'm going to discuss colon cancer, which is one of the westernized diseases or non-communicable diseases which are strongly associated with westernization. I will also argue that diet affects cancer risk through its effects on the colonic microbiota rather than a direct effect. I'd like to share with you a little figure here, which gives you some idea of how food can interact with the microbiota to change cancer risk. So if we eat a diet, it's full of all sorts of complex nutrients. The small intestine is incredibly efficient in digesting 95%, which is actually absorbed into the systemic circulation and maintains body health. However, there's a small fraction that goes through resistant to enzyme digestion into the colon. And there, not by chance, is a massive microbiota measuring up to 10 to the 15 per gram stool, which is the highest density of microbes in the world. And they rely on what's left over from digestion, particularly fiber, for their health and welfare. And in return for that, the microbes produce metabolites. So if you're on a high fiber diet, high plant-based diet, you produce metabolites which are in fact anti-inflammatory and form the essential food source for the colonic cells and maintain colonic health and prevent cancer. On the other hand, if you eat a diet which is rich in fat and meat, then the microbes metabolize that to metabolites which are actually inflammatory and increase colon cancer risk. Furthermore, if you eat a very high fiber diet, it can circumvent all of these areas. It can go through the mucosa, short chain fatty acids into the systemic circulation and suppress inflammation in the systemic circulation as well, hence expressing the explanation for why high fiber diets might in fact not only reduce colonic diseases and colon cancer, but also cancers of the rest of the body. So if we look at the geographic distribution of colon cancer, it's remarkable. In Africa, there are very low rates. In America and the westernized world, very high rates. And there have been massive epidemiological studies conducted around the world, and they've compared the mortality or the incidence rates of cancers in those countries with what people eat. And they've found convincing evidence that red meat, processed meats, and animal fats increase your risk of colon cancer, whereas if you have a high fiber diet, you have a low risk of colon cancer. So moving on here, sorry, it skipped one slide and go back, there's a delay. So I will argue that fiber deficiency has been with us ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we suddenly produced a massive amounts of food and grains, which had to be processed and transported to the cities to maintain the burgeoning population. And to do this, most of the fiber was removed from the foods because it was considered non-nutritious. They did not know about the microbiota. The studies that we're doing at the moment are going into details of why some populations have very low, high, and extreme risks of colon cancer. We're studying Africans, rural Africans who rarely get polyps and cancer, less than 5 per 100,000. African Americans who, as you know, have just heard, have the highest prevalence of colon cancer in the USA at over 65 per 100,000. And the remarkable statistic that Alaska Native people, who used to be called Eskimos, have the highest recorded instance of colon cancer in the world at over 100 per 100,000. And with the help of the NCI, we're doing progressive studies to look at nutrition and metabolic and microbiome effects that might explain these differences. So to summarize, in Africans, we found doing rural studies that they consume a high fiber diet, just as Burkett described many years ago, in association with a low meat and fat intake, which is associated with high rates of butyrgenesis, which is anti-carcinogenic and anti-neoplastic. And if you measure the mucosal proliferation rates, they're very low. So that's the best situation. Then you move to African Americans who unfortunately consume the reverse type of diet with a low fiber, high meat, high fat diet. And this is associated with reversed effects with low rates of butyrgenesis, so loss of suppression of neoplastic change, and high rates of bile acid synthesis, because if you eat a lot of fat, you produce bile acids and they're converted to secondary bile acids in the colon, which are carcinogenic. Both of these factors added together produce mucosal inflammation, proliferation, and neoplastic change. So how are we quite sure that the diet explains the differences in cancer risk around the world, or between Native Africans and African Americans? It could be due to a wide variety of other things such as food, sanitation, housing. So what we did was a fairly unique dietary swap. So we got 2 match groups of adult, healthy Native Africans who we studied in a rural facility, hotel, where we provided all the foods and gave them terrible westernized foods for 2 weeks. And we measured, the microbiota and the mucosa before and after that 2-week period. And with African Americans, we admitted them to the CTRC and gave them a westernized diet for that period of time. So basically switched their usual diets. And the results were actually quite remarkable, that within just 2 weeks, we were able to show that the change in African Americans from a westernized diet to an African diet suppressed proliferation. And I don't know if you can see that, but the little black dots are proliferative cells. And this is before and this is after fiber supplementation, dramatic drops. And the exact reverse in Native Africans, very low proliferation before, put on a westernized diet, very high. And the same thing happened for inflammatory markers down here, intraepithelial lymphocytes and lamina propria macrophages were suppressed by a high fiber diet and increased in Africans given the reverse diet. When we looked at the microbiota interactions, there were a vast number of pathways that changed. So for instance, in African Americans, when they're given the high fiber diet, a lot of nodes of interaction opened up, which were associated with increased butyrgenesis, and the reverse happened in Africans. So we've recently published a review on the evidence showing that fiber deficiency increases the rate of higher income lifestyle associated diseases or non-communicable diseases or westernized diseases. As an extension of Burkitt's hypothesis, who found in the 50s that the low rate of cancer in Africans was associated with a high fiber diet, eating about 50 grams per day. And since his time, we've made a step further because they didn't know about the microbiome, and we've demonstrated that in fact, if you eat a lot of fiber, high fiber, up to 50 grams a day, it, as I said before, short-chain fatty acids don't just affect health of the colon, but also go into systemic circulation, where they can link to G protein coupled receptors, stimulate GLP and PYY to affect insulin secretion and into the brain to promote satiety and reduce food intake, hence forming a novel way of controlling obesity. And secondly, butyrate itself is epigenetic, is a histone acetylase inhibitor, which is metabolized in the body to acetyl-CoA, which alters the expression of a wide variety of genes, some of which regulate proliferation, apoptosis, and differentiation, which is axionomic with carcinogenesis. So our latest studies now are looking at why Africans are suddenly getting a massive increase in westernized diseases with development. And we've seen the change in diet from one which is plant and fruit rich to one now which is unfortunately stimulated by westernized commercial chains such as this, serving burgers and chips and so on and so forth. They all love it, but unfortunately it's not as good as their own traditional food. And in Alaska Natives, as we've said already, they eat a massive amount of really high quality meat and fat, fish oils and so on, but they don't eat vegetables. There's very, very little fiber in their diets, and we're supplementing them with an NCI grant now to get them up to 50 grams a day to see if we can actually reverse this tragic sequence of events. So in summary, why are obese individuals from underserved, ethnically diverse populations at high risk for colon cancer, in general? Because they consume more fast foods, deficient in fiber-rich foods, high in meat and fat, with reduced butyrgenesis, increased carcinogen production. And public health programs we recommend need to be developed as beautifully displayed by Marvella's program talk, to promote the consumption of high fiber plant-based foods and to maintain a healthy colonic balance to prevent carcinogenesis, not only in the colon, but also in the systemic circulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. O'Keefe. And now we will hear from Dr. Francesca Gany, who is at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She's the Chief Immigrant Health and Cancer Disparities Center at Memorial Sloan Kettering. She's Associate Director of Community Outreach and Engagement and Professor of Medicine, Healthcare Policy and Research at the Weill Cornell Medical College.
Thanks so much. And I'm really delighted to be here today to speak with you about obesity, social determinants, with a focus on food insecurity and cancer. Sorry, okay. So immigrants comprise over 14% of the US population, and their obesity rates vary greatly across the immigrant groups. For instance, Hispanics are the largest immigrant groups, with Mexicans being the largest Hispanic group with over 11 million people. And 81% of US Mexican origin men and 78% of US Mexican origin women are overweight and obese. That's the highest percentage among immigrant groups. In contrast, for example, to African-born Blacks and Caribbean-born Blacks who have much lower rates of obesity. Increased length of stay in the US is associated with higher rates of obesity among foreign-born populations. So what are some of the social determinants that impact obesity in immigrant populations? I already mentioned length of stay. There are other immigration-related factors such as immigration status. I'll talk about that in a second. Cultural norms around overweight and obesity and lack of culturally tailored interventions, the lack of linguistically responsive nutrition information, neighborhood factors such as the lack of green space in the built environment in which immigrants are more likely to reside, neighborhoods that are unsafe for walking, high stress, insurance and healthcare access. Do people have access to a PCP or other sources of nutrition education? Employment. Do immigrants' employment give them enough income to buy healthy foods? What are the hours of employment? Are they working shift work, which is interfering with their sleep patterns, which is then leading to obesity? And then food security. We already heard about food deserts, also an issue for a lot of immigrant communities, and immigration status. What is the eligibility for certain immigrants for food programs such as SNAP? And do immigrants apply for benefits, or are they staying away because of factors such as a fear of being labeled a public charge, which certainly got worse over the last 4 years? So food insecurity is an inconsistent access to enough food for a healthy and active life. And food security and insecurity are assessed using the 18-item USDA food security screener, or one of the shorter versions that might be easier to use in a clinical practice. The highest rates of food insecurity are in major metropolitan areas, but other areas are not immune, certainly. And food insecurity disproportionately affects immigrant, ethnic minority, and low-income households. And food insecurity and obesity, as we've heard, often coexist. So in terms of cancer care and food insecurity, cancer patients often have increased nutritional needs. Food insecurity in cancer patients leads to poorer functional, emotional, and social well-being, a higher risk for depression. But the treatment-related cost of cancer and the income loss that can come with a cancer diagnosis contribute to food insecurity. And this can lead to delays in care and practices among immigrants to not adhere to medication and appointments due to costs. So we looked at that patients coming to a comprehensive cancer center and found that 18 to 30% of these patients were food insecure. And in New York City, underserved cancer patients in safety net clinics were very likely to be in food insecure. 56% of the patients were food insecure, which is so much higher than local and national rates. Housing status and type and other essential needs were associated with food security status. So food security was really a window into other socioeconomic needs that people had. Community food pantries, we looked at how well these address the needs of our cancer patients and found that they unfortunately did not and do not. The hours of operation really didn't work with the complex treatment programs that immigrants who had cancer had to undergo, and the hours they had to be in the clinics. Their location wasn't good, and the foods that they had really were not medically tailored to folks who are undergoing cancer treatment. So we developed a series of cancer clinic-based, so co-located at the cancer clinics, food pantries that were medically tailored, that the cancer patients and the safety net clinics and also at some of the comprehensive cancer centers could access, and they were really popular. However, there were some drawbacks to just having a food pantry, such as patients still couldn't buy the exact foods that they wanted, and sometimes it was really difficult for them to lug home the heavy bags of food. So we developed a voucher intervention as well as a home grocery delivery intervention, and then studied these in a pilot randomized controlled trial, which was the first prospective study of food insecurity interventions for cancer patients. There were 6 months of participation on the part of the patients, and patients could have any cancer diagnosis or stage, but they needed to be starting chemo or radiation therapy or both. And we looked at 4 outcomes. Treatment completion is the primary outcome, appointment attendance, food security score or status change, quality of life, and depressive symptoms. So we found that with the voucher and the pantry arm, we got the best treatment completion rate, 94%, followed by the delivery plus pantry arm, and then the pantry arms. 55% of patients who became food secure at follow-up had full appointment attendance versus 24% of the patients who were still food insecure at follow-up. PHQ-9 scores and FACT-G scores for quality of life improved across all of the arms, but we only saw statistically significant differences in the pantry-only arm and the delivery plus pantry arms. We also looked at what food choices people made in the voucher arm, because this was the arm in which people could make their own choices about foods, and found that on average, 77% of funds were spent on healthy foods each month. Interestingly, patients with limited English proficiency and patients who were born outside of the US more generally, even if they were English proficient, spent more money on healthy foods than their US-born peers. We looked at the costs across the arms. So for 1 month, the pantry only arm costs $202 per patient, pantry plus voucher, $235, and the pantry plus delivery arm, $258. So this was such a successful study that we've now expanded it with funding from the NCI to a much larger study of 480 patients, where we're looking at pantries alone, grocery home delivery, and clinic-based and food vouchers. We're doing the study in breast cancer patients who have stage 1, 2, or 3 breast cancer at 4 Bronx institutions. And we've added a new exploratory aim now to look at the impact of the COVID pandemic on food security and treatment completion. So I want to take 1 second to talk about the food interventions and COVID-19. We've really had to pivot with COVID-19 to address the essential needs of our patients. And we're trying to give more and more of our patients access to grocery deliveries, contactless on-site food pickup, COVID relief food gift cards, and providing a lot of assistance with unemployment, SNAP, and other public benefits. We are finding tremendous reports of cancer care barriers, including issues with telehealth, access to safe transportation, stress and anxiety, and COVID-related care disruptions. And we're working on interventions now to address these, including a growing intervention on telehealth. So I just want to give a shout out to our food team that has gone through thick and thin through the COVID pandemic to make sure that our patients can eat, that they still have housing, and that they're able to access their appointments. And I'd like to, these are some of them in action with the food pantries. And I'd also really like to address our funders and thank our funders to whom we're so grateful, and our entire team. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the panelists for doing a wonderful job in their presentations. And now we're going to go to questions and answers from our guests today. I hear we have a lot of people on, and if you have a question you'd like to propose, please, I guess just put it in the chat box. And I'm going to start by asking the panelists a first question, and that is, if each of you could give your answer for this, with like, what are the major barriers in disparities research on obesity and cancer? Maybe each panelists can identify one particular barrier that they identify with.
Okay, I guess I'll start.
Sure.
So always a barrier. I mean, funding is a problem, right? Because these studies, as I mentioned, we want large studies where we can actually do this granular analysis to understand body composition and effect by subtype, by subgroup, and all these kinds of things. So it requires a lot of money. People think that minorities don't want to participate in research, but I don't think that that's true. Sometimes it's difficult to reach them. So we just need the, be community-based, work with community partners, work with cancer advocates so that we can actually reach them. My own experience is that once they know about the study, for the most part, they want to participate. So I will stop there and let other people talk.
Okay, Dr. Ford, you have a quick answer?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Thank you. And I think a barrier, I think, is not including some of the social determinants of health. So I think it's really important to include those factors and to understand why the context in which people are making the food choices that they're making. And I think the interventions like the last one that we heard can help to change that context and give people different options, but to start with an understanding that people are operating from the options that they see available to them. And so really trying to partner with them and develop a real partnership and a relationship so that together, the researchers and the community members can develop strategies that will be helpful and successful with the input of the community members, finding out, getting their input into the services or the interventions that they would like to receive. Thank you. So that concludes my response. Thank you.
Do you want me to say something?
I was responding to the question.
Yeah, I think we lost Lucile for a second. So go ahead,
okay.
give your response.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I heard the original question very well, but the thing is that it's a question of education, and I'm not just talking about minorities. I'm talking about the general population in the USA and every westernized country, that they don't realize what the power of good eating is, and the way that we've varied away from what we evolved to eat, which maintains body health. And the best example of this is that you can actually reduce your risk of colon cancer 20-fold by changing to a plant-based diet. A very simple thing to do, and people say, oh, you can't do it, you can't change diet, but that's not true. They said the same thing about cigarettes, that you never stop smoking. We need the media, we need on our side, we need to cut out advertising of fast foods and things and make a really concerted effort to change back to a diet which is more natural. And I believe that the next generation will show us the way.
Thank you, Dr. O'Keefe. Dr. Bae Jump, from the biological side.
I was going to say, I'm going to throw something a little bit different out there, is that one of the things, I'm a little bit more of a basic scientist, and we actually have very few mouse models or patient-derived xenograft models or cell line models from racially and ethnically diverse women. And so I think that can be a barrier of research too, because as I talked about in my talk, we have these more aggressive non-endometrioid tumors or serous tumors, but we actually don't have any really great models or mouse models of those endometrial cancers. So I think we need to strive more to collect tumors from more diverse women and derive these models to really look at the genomics of how obesity can affect these models across the board, and not really just sticking with our more common endometrioid tumors.
Thank you. And Dr. Gany, from a food insecurity standpoint.
So,
barriers.
yeah, so I think that the issue is complicated by the fact that it involves so many systems It involves the individual level, it involves the whole food justice system, and it involves the media and industry, and so we really need to be addressing things and studying them at multiple levels, and to be looking at the interactions between the multiple levels, because if we try to plug a hole on one level, then something else is going to spring up that's fed by one of the other levels. So I think that's really the key. And it's complicated to do research across multiple levels and to be able to affect change without involving all of those different systems and levels and participants in the work.
Thank you very much. Now I have an additional question for the panel as a whole, and then we'll move into the individual ones. And the question in many ways builds on some of the comments you made, Dr. Gany, with regards to the COVID impact. And what I'm wondering is if each panelist might be able to share very briefly, what are some suggested actions, or maybe to start with, what are some of the impact, what the impact of COVID has been on your community? And then just perhaps one or two suggested ways to help mitigate the adverse effect of COVID as we try to work to bring this pandemic under control. Dr. Bandera, would you like to start again?
Okay. So we know that, as I mentioned earlier, briefly in my talk, there's clearly implications for COVID for both minorities. So minorities are being more affected, but particularly obese individuals too. So I think this is going to have effects in the detecting cancer at a more advanced stage with complications for treatment. There's hesitation of people going right now to get the screening. All of us, you don't want to go to the hospital, so you don't go to screening. Sometimes is also affecting getting the necessary treatments. So I think we're going to see all these effects. And now is the immunization. We also know that there's some disparities in minorities are less likely to get the vaccine. The data is coming. We don't know if it's vaccine hesitation or is that is not being offered to them. We know that is sometimes, at least in New Jersey, you have to register to get the vaccine, but if you don't have access to the internet, there's an issue. So I think that we're going to see the effects in general for minorities, but also specifically for obese patients that are already at risk of all disease. And I won't talk anymore. I can keep going on and on.
Thank you so much. Dr. O'Keefe.
So it's very interesting, and the combination of obesity and a fiber deficient diet makes you extremely high risk for catching or for getting COVID infections. People forget that the virome is part of the microbiome, and that there's a very close working association between the two, so that if you disturb one, you can disturb the other. And one of the key factors in COVID susceptibility is obesity and diabetes. And because, you know, the inflammatory effects that it has on the body in general. And not by chance, if you have a fiber deficient diet, then from what I've said in my talk, the anti-inflammatory effects of butyrate and short-chain fatty acids is not there. And so I think that there really is a very good, strong rationale for looking after people who have active COVID infections by making sure that they have a balanced diet, in particular a high fiber diet, so that it can exert its anti-inflammatory effects in the systemic circulation as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ford, from the community
thank you for that question. Yes, thank you. You know, with all of the of course, the pandemic has been very tragic, but I think that one thing it has done is to really shed light on really underserved communities. And I think that's a good thing, because now we see how the communities have been living, and we have so many opportunities to intervene now. So we've talked about telehealth, telemedicine. In the I-95 corridor of economic disadvantage in South Carolina, a lot of the counties don't have broadband access. So we can see now that if we continue to move forward with telehealth and telemedicine without giving those communities broadband access, they will be left even more behind than other communities. So now there is a push now to get rural communities broadband access so they can become included. And I think that's just one example of something that's come about because of COVID-19. I think another factor is, again, the focus on obesity and the role of obesity, not only in COVID-19 as a COVID-19 risk factor, but also the risk factor for so many chronic diseases, and kind of looking at the underlying biological mechanisms of those diseases, linking those factors with diet and nutritional intake. And I think that's really critically important. That's another, you could say, unintended consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And my colleagues and I have done some work. My colleague, Dr. David Turner, is a biologist, but together we've done work on advanced glycation end products, which are markers of biological inflammation associated with diabetes and cancer, and looking at nutrition. And I think Dr. O'Keefe said, as we gain in knowledge, we can use that to inform our behavior change interventions. And so I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has really showed us the importance of nutrition and physical activity. But it also shows us that we are only as healthy as the unhealthiest member of our community. So when we're facing a pandemic, it doesn't matter if one pocket of the community is extremely healthy. If you have another pocket that's very unhealthy, that will ultimately affect everyone.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gany, anything in addition you'd like to add?
Yeah, so just we've said a lot of it already, but I do want to say that to mitigate the situation now in underserved communities, we have to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to get the vaccine out to the underserved community members. I mean, there's a little bit of there's discussion about vaccine hesitancy, but there's not enough discussion about vaccine access. There's some discussion around it, and really making sure that the vaccine is available to everyone across the community, including folks for whom it's harder to get it to. So I think that's right now really key, in addition to supporting the community in so many other ways and really addressing the disparities we've seen loud and clear, or heard loud and clear.
Very good. Thank you so much. We have a question with regards to conceptualizing race and how, in terms of studies examining genetic factors to understand associations between obesity and cancer. The question is about how researchers are conceptualizing race as a variable in these studies. Dr. Bae Jump, perhaps you might kick that one off for us.
I think that's a very, very good question, because for many population-based studies, we are going on self-identified race. However, for example, the Carolina endometrial cancer study, where we're collecting tumors, we will be looking at ancestry markers as well, to make sure that we do see kind of the correlation between race and then what we also, race as well as in the tumor. So there are definitely ways to do it, scientifically as well. So although the Carolina breast cancer study was a long ongoing study in North Carolina, and actually found very good concordance between the two. And so we're assuming, since we are also in North Carolina, that that's what we're going to find too, but definitely something that we will look at.
Thank you so much. We also had a question about the stigma associated with obesity, and to what extent the obesity stigma is being investigated within the context of disparity. In other words, with regard to, say, for example, effective screening. Might someone be willing to take that one on? A number of you talked with regards to the community.
So happy to respond to that. I think that's a very good question. And I think, you know, we want to approach it the way we would approach any issue. It's just, we're investigators, and the idea is to be non-judgmental. I mean, we're working with communities, and we're trying to develop and test interventions that will ultimately, we believe, will benefit the health of the community. And so I think we just approach it the way we approach any research topic. You know, I think within certain communities, there is not as much stigma associated with overweight and obesity in some communities as in others.
Thank you so much. And the next question is with regards to the microbiome in cancer. This one may be for you, Dr. O'Keefe. In the last few years, there's been quite a bit of attention on the microbiome in cancer. There is some concern, though, with regards to whether minorities are underrepresented in these studies. And the question is about current initiatives that really promote engagement and involvement of minority groups in these studies.
So I'm afraid your voice is a little bit furry, and
okay.
Can you just give it in
Sure.
a nutshell?
Sure. It's about the studies that involve the microbiome and cancer, and issues with regards to minority participation in such studies. Do you know of any studies in that area?
Yes, definitely. A number of the studies that I talked about, particularly the African American intervention diet, was in a minority group, and the study on seeing whether you can, if you give a high fiber addition to the Alaska diet, you can turn everything around by, you know, using the anti-carcinogenic effects of butyrate and short chain fatty acids. So those are two situations which are directly related to the microbiome and the way that you can change it. And the beauty about the nutritional way is that you know, it's non-invasive, and you know, it is in fact what we should be doing. And if you wait for somebody to get cancer, the treatment is pretty horrific by comparison to changing your diet. And so I don't think it's pies in the sky. I think that one can do it, and I think all communities can participate in that. You know, we've done the sort of proof of principle studies. It's now up to public health people, food industry, media, and so on to, you know, to show what is possible. And, you know, there's some beautiful studies with the, I think it was presented by Francesca, I think, was on you know, the cost of providing food supplements for the population, which are really very reasonable and doable. And of course, the cheapest way of all is to grow your own vegetables at home, which I think we should all return to do, and because that's the cheapest way. But all things are possible.
Thank you so much. And a question for you, Dr. Bandera, about whether you'll be looking at measures of central obesity and body composition in relation to type 1 and type 2 endometrial cancer.
Sorry, you faded out a little bit. Look between type 1 and type 2 endometrial cancer. What was the first part? Look at.
Yes, let me find it.
Sorry.
Yeah, measures of central obesity and body composition.
Yes. Actually, will definitely be doing some pilot. We'll be doing some pilot studies from smaller groups of those women where we will actually do home visits, where we will go out and do some of those adiposity markers. We actually, and then also kind of see how that relates to the survey reports like reported weight and reported height and those sort of things. And doing a little bit more deeper dive, collecting some blood. And actually, I'm interested in the uterine microbiome. And so we will be collecting some vaginal swabs and actually rectal swabs as well as part of that study. But that's definitely something that we are going to look at.
Thank you so much.
We just need to find more money, always more money to do more home visits.
Thank you so much. And we do want to be respectful of time today. So with that, unfortunately, we'll need to bring our Q&A to a close. We just want to thank each of our panelists for your excellent presentations. And if everyone would please join me in a round of virtual applause for our panelists and also for our discussants. So again, before closing, what we'd like to do, next slide, please. What we'd like to do is share. Unfortunately, Dr. Adams-Campbell ran into technical difficulties, so we will move from closing remarks. We took a little bit longer for the Q&A and begin to wind the bend for this afternoon. So we did, before we close, like to share that our next 3 webinars will be held each of the remaining Thursdays in March from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our next webinar next Thursday, on March 11th, will focus on intersections between racial and ethnic disparities, obesity, and cancer risk from a basic translational research perspective. The following webinar on March 18th will examine these intersections from a clinical research perspective. And our final webinar on March 25th will focus on the intersections from a behavioral and population-based research perspective. We're excited to bring these webinars to you and hope that you can join us for some, if not all of them. In closing, again, we want to thank our speakers and our discussants. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your research, and your perspectives with us. We are now at the end of our webinar. We thank you for attending and trust you found the information both informative and useful. A link to a brief evaluation for this webinar will be sent to you shortly. Please do take a few minutes to complete it. We really do want to hear from you and welcome your feedback, as it will help inform how we can improve and conduct future webinars. As noted earlier, we did record the webinar. This recording will be available to you and the broader public shortly. Thank you again for attending. Have a terrific rest of your day. Please take care, stay safe, and be well.